The morning sun was just beginning to rise over the Marine Corps base, casting a soft golden light over the rows of chairs set up on the field. Families were already gathering, waving small American flags and chatting excitedly as they waited for the graduation ceremony to begin. It was one of those proud days, a day filled with emotions, pride, and tears. Among the crowd was an older man walking slowly toward the viewing area. His back was slightly bent and his steps were uneven, but his face glowed with pride. He wore a clean but worn-out shirt, a small badge pinned to his chest that read, "Proud Father." This was Mr. Thompson, the father of one of the young Marines who would soon march onto that parade ground. He had been waiting for this day for months. His son Daniel had written letters every week, telling him how tough training was, how he missed home, and how he dreamed of the moment he could finally say, "Dad, I did it." Mr. Thompson had kept every letter neatly folded inside a small box by his bedside. Now, standing at the edge of the crowd, he held his breath, trying to take it all in. The flags, the music, the uniforms. It was all more beautiful than he had imagined. He made his way toward the seating area where families were being directed. A few people smiled and nodded at him, noticing the Proud Father badge. He smiled back shyly, holding onto the strap of his old leather bag that carried his camera and a bottle of water. Just as he reached the entrance to the viewing stands, 2 security guards stopped him. "Sir, we'll need to see your pass," one of them said firmly. Mr. Thompson blinked in confusion. "My pass?" he asked. "I have this badge. They mailed it to me." The guard shook his head. "No, sir. That's not a valid entry pass. Family members were given special access passes through the recruits." Mr. Thompson frowned, reaching into his bag. "I don't have another one. My son told me this would be enough. I came all the way from out of state for this. Please, I'm his father." The guards exchanged a look. One of them sighed and said politely, "I'm sorry, sir, but without the proper credentials, we can't let you in past this point. It's base policy." The old man's heart sank. He tried to reason with them, explaining how proud he was, how long the trip had been, how his son was expecting to see him in the crowd. But the guards stood firm, their expressions stiff and professional. People nearby started noticing. A few families turned their heads, watching as the man tried to plead his case. Some whispered quietly. Others looked away, unsure of what to do. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," he said softly. "I just want to see my boy." The younger guard shifted uncomfortably but didn't move. "I understand, sir, but rules are rules. You'll need to stay behind the fence if you want to watch." Mr. Thompson looked through the fence line. From there, he could still see the parade field, but it was far away. The view was blurry and he wouldn't be able to make out his son's face. His shoulders drooped. For a moment, he thought about turning back. But something in his heart told him to stay. He had promised Daniel he'd be there, and he wasn't going to break that promise. So he found a small spot near the fence, away from the crowd, and stood there quietly. The grass was uneven and he had to shift his weight to ease the ache in his leg, but he didn't complain. He took out his small camera and tried to focus it on the field, testing the zoom. The image wobbled, but it was enough. A few rows away, families cheered as the Marine band began to play. The sound of drums echoed across the field, and the smell of freshly cut grass filled the air. Then, the voice of a commanding officer boomed through the loudspeakers, calling the graduates to attention. Mr. Thompson straightened up. He leaned against the fence, eyes searching for one face among the hundreds of uniforms. And then, there he was. Daniel stood tall, shoulders back, eyes fixed forward. His uniform was spotless, his expression calm and focused. The sight took Mr. Thompson's breath away. That was his boy. The same kid who used to help him fix the old pickup truck. The same kid who used to say he wanted to be strong enough to make his father proud. Mr. Thompson smiled, tears gathering in his eyes. He wanted to shout his son's name, to wave, to tell him how proud he was. But he stayed silent. He didn't want to cause any disruption. He just stood there, gripping the fence, whispering under his breath, "That's my son." As the Marines marched in perfect rhythm, Mr. Thompson's pride grew stronger than his disappointment. He didn't care about the fence anymore. What mattered was that he was here, watching his boy become something great. But a small ache still lingered. He wished he could be closer, to see Daniel's face up close, to shake his hand, maybe even hug him after the ceremony. The guards nearby noticed him from time to time. He wasn't causing trouble, just standing quietly, smiling through tears. One of them whispered something to the other, but neither moved to help. To them, it was just another day, another rule being followed. As the graduation continued, a light breeze swept across the field, carrying the sound of the Marine hymn. Mr. Thompson closed his eyes for a moment, listening. He remembered his wife's voice years ago, telling him how proud she would be when their son wore that uniform. She had passed away before she could see this day, but he felt her there beside him in spirit. He whispered again, "We did it, son. We both did." From the stands, families cheered as the commanding officer called out names. Mr. Thompson clapped softly each time, even though his son's name hadn't been called yet. When it finally was, his heart swelled with emotion. He cheered louder than anyone else, even if most people couldn't hear him from where he stood. A few Marines in the formation noticed the man by the fence, clapping and smiling proudly. One of them recognized the resemblance, the same strong jawline, the same determined look. Quietly, they nudged Daniel and nodded toward the fence. Daniel's eyes flickered for just a second, enough to see the familiar figure standing far away. The distance between them didn't matter. He knew that look. That was his father. He took a slow, steady breath and stood taller than ever before. For Mr. Thompson, that single glance was enough to make everything worth it. The trip, the struggle, the fence, all of it. He didn't know it yet. But this small moment would set off a chain of events that no one expected. A moment that would show the true meaning of respect, family, and the unbreakable bond between a Marine and his loved ones. The ceremony carried on, the sound of boots hitting the ground echoing in perfect rhythm. Families cheered as names were called one by one. Cameras flashed, flags waved, and proud smiles filled the air. But behind the fence, Mr. Thompson stood silently, his hands gripping the metal rail as he tried to catch every glimpse of his son he could. The sun had risen higher now, and its heat pressed down on his shoulders. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but he didn't move. He didn't want to lose his spot. His eyes never left the line of Marines standing tall across the field. Every now and then, someone nearby would glance at him. Some offered polite smiles, others looked away, unsure what to say. Most didn't know what was happening, that the old man standing quietly behind the fence wasn't just another passerby. He was a father who had traveled hundreds of miles just to see his son's proudest moment, only to be kept on the other side. Still, he didn't complain. He didn't raise his voice or argue. He simply stood there, clutching his camera, whispering a small prayer under his breath. "Just let him see me," he murmured. "That's all I need." Out on the parade ground, Daniel tried to focus on the commands being shouted by the drill instructor, but his heart was somewhere else. That brief moment when he saw his father standing by the fence had shaken him more than he expected. He had imagined this day 100 times, his father sitting proudly in the front row, clapping and cheering when his name was called. But now, knowing his father was outside the gate, separated by nothing more than a metal barrier, filled him with a quiet sadness. He wanted to move, to wave, to run over and tell the guards, "That's my dad." But Marines didn't break formation. They didn't move until they were told. So he stayed where he was, standing tall, his jaw tight, his eyes straight ahead. The drill instructor's voice boomed again, and the rows of Marines turned sharply, executing their final movements of the ceremony. The crowd clapped and cheered, their voices filling the air like music. And then, as the official part ended, the commanding officer stepped forward to address the new Marines and their families. His voice carried across the field, deep, firm, and full of pride. He spoke about courage, honor, sacrifice, and family. Every word struck a chord with Mr. Thompson, who listened from behind the fence, nodding slowly. Family. That word stayed with him. When the speech ended, families were invited to meet their loved ones. The crowd began to move forward, rushing toward the young Marines who stood waiting. Laughter, tears, and embraces filled the field. It was a beautiful sight, but not for Mr. Thompson. He stood still, watching everyone reunite. His heart ached to do the same, but the guards were still there, blocking his way. He took a deep breath and stepped forward again, trying one more time. "Please," he said gently to the nearest guard. "My son is out there. He's waiting for me. I just need a few minutes. You can come with me if you want. I won't cause any trouble." The guard looked at him, his expression softening for a brief moment. But then he shook his head. "Sir, I understand. I really do. But orders are orders. Only authorized guests, sir." Mr. Thompson sighed and lowered his gaze. "I see," he whispered. "Thank you anyway." He turned back to the fence, his shoulders a little heavier this time. On the field, Daniel finally found his friends' families hugging and taking photos. The laughter around him made him happy for them, but also reminded him that his own father wasn't there. He scanned the area and found him again, standing quietly at the edge of the fence line watching. That sight broke something inside him. His father looked tired, his clothes slightly wrinkled from travel, but his smile was still there. Small, humble, proud. Daniel felt a lump in his throat. The Marines beside him noticed his sudden silence. One of them, a tall man with a calm voice, followed his gaze. "Is that your dad?" he asked softly. Daniel nodded without speaking. The Marine looked again. "Why is he standing out there?" "They wouldn't let him in," Daniel replied quietly. "He didn't get the right pass, I guess. He came all this way and now he's stuck outside." The Marine's eyebrows furrowed. "That's not right." Another Marine standing nearby overheard them. "Wait, that's his father? The old guy by the fence?" "Yeah," Daniel said. "He raised me alone. He worked every day, saved everything just to help me get here. I wanted him to see this up close." The group fell silent for a moment. None of them liked what they were hearing. They all knew what it meant for family to be there, what it meant to feel that pride. One of them finally said, "We can't just let him stand there." They shared quick looks, the kind that spoke louder than words. It wasn't planned, but they all understood what needed to happen. Without saying anything more, they began to move toward their commanding officer, who was standing a few yards away. Daniel hesitated. Part of him worried it might cause trouble, but another part of him knew his father deserved this. He followed. The Marines approached the officer respectfully. The tall one spoke first, explaining the situation. The officer listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When they finished, he looked toward the fence. From where he stood, he could see the old man, a father standing alone among the crowd, his hand resting on the fence, watching with quiet pride. The officer's eyes softened. "Is that him?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Daniel replied. The officer was silent for a few seconds. Then, without another word, he began walking toward the fence. The Marines followed. The crowd watched curiously as the group crossed the field. Mr. Thompson saw them coming and straightened up, unsure what was happening. One of the guards stepped forward, ready to stop them, but the officer raised a hand. "It's all right," he said firmly. "He's coming with us." The guard froze, then stepped back without another word. Mr. Thompson blinked, not sure he'd heard correctly. "Sir," he said softly. The officer smiled faintly. "You're the father of one of our Marines, aren't you?" "Yes, sir," he replied. "I just wanted to see him." "Well," the officer said, "then let's fix that." He motioned for Mr. Thompson to follow. The old man hesitated, then nodded slowly. The Marine stepped aside to make a path for him. As he walked across the field, his heart raced. For the first time that day, he felt the weight lift off his chest. The cheers, the music, the laughter, and it all came alive around him. And there, waiting at the other end, stood Daniel, standing tall, his eyes glistening with pride and emotion. It was a moment that neither of them would ever forget. The field fell quiet for a moment as everyone watched the small group crossing from the fence line. Families turned their heads, whispering softly, trying to figure out what was going on. The officer walked slowly beside Mr. Thompson, who still looked unsure if this was really happening. The Marines behind them stood tall, their eyes filled with pride and respect. It wasn't every day something like this happened. This wasn't part of the ceremony. This wasn't written in any rule book. But it felt right. Mr. Thompson's hands trembled slightly as he walked. His heart thumped fast in his chest. He could barely believe the guards had stepped aside, that the officer himself had come to get him. The smell of the freshly cut grass, the sound of families cheering, and the warmth of the sun all felt stronger now. For the first time that morning, he felt like he truly belonged there. When they reached the middle of the field, Daniel stood waiting, his uniform neat and perfect, his posture straight but his eyes wet with emotion. For a second, neither of them moved. They just stared at each other, father and son, both frozen in disbelief. Then Daniel took a few quick steps forward and saluted sharply, his hand rising with precision and pride. Mr. Thompson's voice caught in his throat. He raised his shaky hand and returned the salute as best he could, his eyes filling with tears. The officer stood silently nearby, watching the moment unfold. Even he couldn't hide the faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Then Daniel lowered his hand and stepped closer. He whispered, his voice trembling, "You made it, Dad." Mr. Thompson's lips quivered. "I wouldn't have missed it for the world," he said softly. "I just didn't think they'd let me through." Daniel glanced at the Marines standing nearby. "They made sure of it," he said. The Marines stood a short distance away, hands behind their backs, watching quietly. One of them nodded respectfully toward Mr. Thompson, who nodded back with gratitude. The officer turned to the guards standing by the fence. "No one keeps a Marine's father behind a gate," he said firmly, loud enough for everyone around to hear. "Not today." The guards lowered their eyes, embarrassed, but the officer's tone wasn't angry. It was proud. It was a reminder that rules mattered, but so did people. Nearby, the crowd began to clap. It started softly, then grew louder. Families, Marines, and even base staff joined in. They didn't know all the details, but they could feel what this moment meant. Mr. Thompson tried to hold back his tears, but they fell freely. He had dreamed of this day for so long, of seeing his son as a Marine, of being close enough to shake his hand and tell him how proud he was. And now, surrounded by the very men his son trained with, that dream had finally come true. Daniel took a small step forward and said quietly, "You shouldn't have had to wait out there." His father smiled weakly. "I didn't mind. I just wanted to see you." "That was enough." Daniel shook his head gently. "No, Dad, you deserve to be here. Right here beside me." The officer placed a hand on Mr. Thompson's shoulder. "You raised a fine Marine," he said warmly, "and I can see where he gets his strength." Mr. Thompson laughed softly, wiping his eyes. He was always stronger than he thought. The officer gave a respectful nod, then turned to the Marines. "Let's show this man how we honor family." At once, the Marines formed a line on both sides of Mr. Thompson and Daniel. The sound of boots hitting the ground echoed in rhythm as they stood at attention. It wasn't planned. It wasn't rehearsed. But it was perfect. Daniel helped his father stand between them. Together, they walked slowly toward the reviewing stand, surrounded by Marines in full uniform. The audience went quiet again, watching the unexpected but deeply moving sight. Mr. Thompson could hardly see through the tears in his eyes. Every step he took felt heavy with pride and love. He looked around at the young men and women walking beside him and whispered, "You're all my sons too, you know that?" One of the Marines smiled and said, "Yes, sir, we do." That small exchange made everyone around them smile. It was a simple moment, but it carried more emotion than any speech could. When they reached the front of the field, Daniel turned to his father. "This is where I wanted you to sit," he said softly. Mr. Thompson looked at the seat reserved near the front, one of the best spots in the entire field. He shook his head. "I think I've already had the best seat here," he said, his eyes glancing back toward the fence he had stood behind just minutes earlier. They both laughed quietly. It was the kind of laugh that comes from relief and love mixed together, the kind that only family can share after a hard moment turns into something unforgettable. The officer motioned for the ceremony to continue, but something about the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't just another graduation anymore. It was a reminder to everyone there that behind every Marine, every soldier, every uniform, there's someone who sacrificed, who waited, who believed. When the band began to play again, the Marines returned to their positions, and Daniel stood proudly beside his father for a moment longer. He leaned closer and said, "Mom would have been proud too." Mr. Thompson smiled softly, looking up at the sky. "She's here," he said. "She's watching." A few of the Marines who stood nearby looked down, touched by the quiet honesty in his words. They didn't know the full story, but they didn't need to. The emotion spoke for itself. As the rest of the ceremony unfolded, Mr. Thompson stayed seated near the front, right where he belonged. Every few minutes, Daniel would glance over at him, making sure he was all right. And each time his father would give a small nod, his smile never fading. When the final salute was given and the crowd erupted in applause, Daniel turned one last time and found his father clapping proudly. Their eyes met again, And this time there was no distance, no fence, no separation. Just love, pride, and respect. As the ceremony ended, families began to gather their things and Marines started posing for photos. Daniel stayed behind, standing next to his father, the officer, and the group of Marines who had helped make it all possible. Mr. Thompson looked at them all and said quietly, "Thank you, boys. You didn't just help me. You reminded me what kind of men my son serves with." One Marine grinned. "Sir, we take care of our own." The words hung in the air like a promise. Mr. Thompson smiled wider than he had all day. "I can see that," he said. And for the first time since arriving that morning, everything felt right. He wasn't just a visitor anymore. He was part of something bigger, a family bound not by rules or badges, but by respect and heart. The crowd slowly began to settle again, but the air around the field felt different now. Something had changed. What had just happened wasn't part of the schedule, yet it felt like the most important moment of the whole day. People whispered to one another, pointing toward Mr. Thompson sitting proudly in the front row beside his son. A few even wiped away tears. You could feel the respect in the air, quiet, honest, and powerful. Daniel stood at attention once more, his uniform shining in the sunlight. But this time his heart was calm. The weight that had been pressing on him all morning was gone. He had his father there, right where he belonged. The commanding officer returned to the podium. He paused for a moment, looking over the sea of faces before him. His voice was calm, but there was emotion behind it when he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "today we celebrate the graduation of these young men and women into the United States Marine Corps. But before we move on, I want to acknowledge something that happened here today, something that shows the heart of what being a Marine truly means." The crowd grew silent. Even the breeze seemed to pause. He turned slightly, glancing toward Mr. Thompson. "Earlier this morning there was a misunderstanding at the gate. One of our Marines' fathers was stopped and unable to enter. But his fellow Marines noticed, and they made sure that didn't stand. They did what Marines do best, and they took care of their own." Every head turned toward Mr. Thompson. He looked down shyly, not used to being the center of attention. But when he lifted his eyes again, he found hundreds of people smiling at him, strangers, families, Marines, all clapping with genuine warmth. Daniel stood tall beside him, pride glowing in his chest. The officer continued, "We train these men and women to fight, to lead, to serve, but above all, we teach them to stand for what's right." Today that wasn't just words. It was action. The applause grew louder, rolling across the field like a wave. Mr. Thompson felt his throat tighten. He had never expected this kind of moment. He was just a simple man, someone who worked with his hands, who raised his son the best way he could. Now here he was being honored by an entire Marine base. He turned to his son and whispered, "I didn't mean for all this to happen." Daniel smiled softly. "Neither did they, Dad. They just did what was right." The music started again, slow, proud, and steady. The band played the Marine Corps hymn, and every Marine in uniform stood straighter, eyes forward, hearts beating as one. Mr. Thompson stood too. He didn't know the protocol, but something in him told him he couldn't sit while they stood. When the music swelled, he raised his hand in a shaky salute. The officer on the podium noticed and gave one back. It was a small moment, but the meaning behind it carried farther than words could reach. When the final note faded, the ceremony came to a close. Families began flooding the field again, hugging, laughing, taking pictures. Kids waved small flags, parents cried openly, and the sound of joy filled the air. Mr. Thompson stayed seated for a while, just watching. Every few minutes, someone would come up to him. Other parents, Marines, even base staff, and shaking his hand, thanking him, telling him how much they respected what had happened. One woman said softly, "You must be so proud of your son," he smiled. "I always have been," he said. "But today I'm proud of all of them." A small group of Marines who had helped bring him in came over. One of them said, "Sir, we just wanted to say, we're glad you're here." Mr. Thompson looked at them, his eyes full of gratitude. "I'm the one who should be thanking you," he said. "You didn't have to do what you did, but you did it anyway." The Marine shook his head. "That's what family does." They shared a firm handshake, the kind that carries respect on both sides. A few photographers from local media, who had been covering the graduation, had captured the moment when Mr. Thompson was brought across the field. One of them approached him and asked if they could share the story. He hesitated. "It's not really my story," he said modestly. "It's theirs. These boys, these Marines, they're the story." But later that evening, when photos began spreading online, people all over started sharing them. They showed an old man in a simple shirt being escorted by Marines through the crowd, his face filled with emotion. The caption read, "When guards tried to stop a Marine's father, the Marines made sure he walked through with honor." The story spread quickly, touching hearts everywhere. It wasn't about conflict or rules. It was about love, respect, and the bond between a father and his son, and the men who stood beside them. Back on the base, as the sun began to set, the field slowly emptied. Daniel and his father stayed behind, sitting together on one of the benches near the parade ground. The air was warm, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. For a long time, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them was full of pride, gratitude, and peace. Finally, Mr. Thompson broke the silence. "You know," he said quietly, "when your mother passed, I didn't know if I'd be enough for you. I didn't know if I could raise you right." Daniel turned to him, his voice soft but steady. "You were more than enough, Dad. You gave me everything that matters." Mr. Thompson smiled faintly. "I just wanted to see you become a good man. And today, I saw it." Daniel looked down, trying to hide the emotion in his eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you." They sat there until the lights around the field began to flicker on. The once loud bass was now quiet. The only sounds were the distant hum of vehicles and the chirping of crickets beginning to sing. Mr. Thompson looked out across the empty field and said, "This place, it's not just about uniforms and rules, is it?" Daniel shook his head. "No, Dad, it's about people. It's about doing the right thing, even when no one's watching." Mr. Thompson nodded slowly. "Then I guess that's what makes you all Marines." Daniel smiled and placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "No, Dad. That's what makes us your sons." Mr. Thompson laughed quietly, his eyes glistening once again. "Then I'm the luckiest man alive." They sat there a while longer, just watching the sky fade into night. Around them, the base lights shimmered softly and the air was calm. The day that had started with confusion and heartbreak had ended with honor and belonging. Mr. Thompson didn't have a medal, a uniform, or a title. But that day, every Marine on that field saw him as one of their own. And though he didn't say it out loud, he felt it deep in his heart. He wasn't just the father of one Marine. He was now part of something much bigger, something that would live on in every story told about that day. The next morning, the base was quieter. Most families had already gone home, and the parade field that had been full of life the day before was now empty and still. Flags still fluttered softly in the breeze, and the scent of the grass lingered in the air. Daniel and his father walked side by side, their steps slow and easy. They didn't say much at first. They were both still processing everything that had happened the day before. Mr. Thompson looked out across the field and smiled. "It feels different when it's quiet," he said softly. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, yesterday feels like a dream." "It wasn't a dream," his father said with a small laugh. "Though I still can't believe all that happened. I was just hoping to stand somewhere I could see you. I never thought I'd end up walking across the field like that." Daniel smiled. "The Marines weren't going to let you stand out there alone." Mr. Thompson looked at his son for a long moment. "They reminded me a lot of you," he said. "Strong, proud, but humble. They didn't have to do that, but they did." "That's what family does," Daniel replied. "In the Marines, we say we never leave anyone behind." "I guess that counts for fathers, too." His father chuckled. "I guess it does." They walked toward a small bench near the flagpole and sat down. The morning sun was soft and warm, and the air was filled with the distant sounds of life on the base. Footsteps, laughter, the hum of trucks moving supplies. Mr. Thompson leaned back and let out a deep sigh. "You know, when I was standing behind that fence, I started to think maybe I didn't belong there. Everyone had their passes, their nice clothes, their places to sit. I felt like I'd come all that way for nothing." Daniel looked at him quietly. "But then," Mr. Thompson continued, "when those Marines came to get me, I realized something. I might not wear a uniform, but I belong here just the same. Not because of me, but because of you. Daniel smiled, his eyes soft. You've always belonged, Dad. Everything I am started with you. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The breeze brushed through the flags, and the sun glinted off Daniel's medals. Mr. Thompson looked proud, but also thoughtful. When your mother and I first had you, he said quietly, we used to talk about what kind of man you'd grow up to be. She always said you'd do something great, something that mattered. I think she was right. Daniel swallowed hard, staring at the ground. I just try to do what's right, Dad. His father nodded slowly. And that's what makes you great. They sat there for a while, lost in their thoughts. Around them, a few Marines walked by and nodded respectfully toward them. Even though the ceremony was over, everyone on base seemed to know who Mr. Thompson was now. He wasn't just another visitor anymore. He was the Marine's father, the man whose quiet love had moved an entire crowd. One of the Marines stopped to shake his hand. Sir, I just wanted to say, that was something special yesterday, he said. You reminded us why we do what we do. Mr. Thompson looked surprised. Me? I didn't do anything. Yes, you did, the Marine said with a smile. You showed us what real pride looks like. After the young man walked away, Mr. Thompson turned to his son and said softly, I think I'm starting to understand what this uniform means. It's not just cloth and medals, Daniel said. It's about values, honor, respect, loyalty. And you've been living those values your whole life, Dad. The older man chuckled. Guess I didn't need a uniform after all. Daniel smiled and nodded. You've always been my example. Later that day, as they packed up to leave, Daniel folded his dress uniform carefully and placed it in his bag. His father watched him, pride shining in his eyes. You've changed, he said quietly. You stand taller now. You carry yourself different. I guess training does that, Daniel said, grinning. No, his father said gently. It's not the training. It's purpose. You found yours. Those words stayed with Daniel. Before they left the base, they stopped once more by the parade ground. The sunlight hit the metal fence that had once separated them. Mr. Thompson walked over and rested his hand on it for a moment. This fence doesn't look like much now, he said softly, but yesterday it felt like a wall. Funny thing is, the people on the other side are the ones who tore it down. Daniel placed a hand on his father's shoulder. That's what makes the Marines different, Dad. We break barriers to not build them. His father smiled. Then keep doing that, son, wherever life takes you. As they drove away from the base, Daniel looked back one last time. The flag waved proudly in the distance, and he could still picture the moment when his father had walked across that field. That image, his father standing tall among the Marines, would stay with him forever. In the weeks that followed, the story of that day continued to spread. Newspapers wrote small pieces about it. People online shared the photos and the short video someone had recorded. It wasn't a flashy story, but it was a heartfelt one, a story about love, respect, and what it truly means to stand together. Some people called it the day the Marines honored a father. Others just called it the fence story. Mr. Thompson never got used to the attention. He didn't see himself as special. When reporters tried to reach him, he would always say the same thing. It wasn't about me. It was about my son, and the men who reminded the world what brotherhood really looks like. For Daniel, the story became a quiet reminder that doing the right thing doesn't always come from big acts. Sometimes it's found in small, human moments. He often told new recruits about that day, about how the Marine stood up for his father without being asked. It became part of how he taught others about honor and compassion. Years later, when Daniel had risen in rank and earned his own command, a new class of Marines would ask him what inspired him most in his career. He never mentioned medals or missions. He always smiled and said, "It was the day my brother stood up for my dad." And somewhere back home, in a small house with a worn-out porch and a few framed photos on the wall, Mr. Thompson would sit in his chair sipping his coffee, looking at a picture of that graduation day, the one where he stood in the middle of the field, surrounded by Marines. Every time he saw it, his heart swelled with quiet pride. He didn't need awards or speeches. That moment had been enough. It was proof that kindness and respect still mattered, that people could still stand up for what was right, and whenever someone asked him about it, he'd smile and say, "That day showed me something special. The Marines may wear the uniform, but it's their hearts that make them who they are." He'd pause, Then add softly, and I'm proud to say, one of them is my son.